What if a quiet fight over maps in just 2 states could decide who controls Congress for the next decade? This is not a hypothetical. In Texas and California, a political chess match is underway, and the stakes could not be higher. Both states are redrawing their congressional districts. A process that might sound technical or even boring, but in reality, it is one of the most powerful tools in American politics. The lines on these maps will determine which communities have a voice in Washington and which do not. And right now, both sides of the political spectrum are using every legal and strategic trick available. According to a recent report from the Associated Press, the redistricting battles in Texas and California alone could shift as many as 10 seats in the House of Representatives. That is enough to flip control from one party to the other in a chamber that has been almost evenly divided for years. So how did we get here, and why does this matter, even if you do not live in either state? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will see exactly how the moves being made in Austin and Sacramento could shape the entire nation's political future. Every 10 years after the United States conducts its national census, each state is required to redraw the boundaries of its congressional districts. This process, known as redistricting, is designed to reflect changes in population so that each district has roughly the same number of residents, ensuring the principle of one person, one vote. In theory, it is about fairness and equal representation. In practice, it often becomes a battle over political power. That is because the group or party in charge of drawing the maps can shape them in ways that tilt the playing field heavily in their favor. This manipulation, known as gerrymandering, has a long history in American politics. The term comes from Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who in 1812 approved a district so oddly shaped that a local newspaper said it looked like a salamander, and the name stuck. Gerrymandering works mainly through two tactics: packing and cracking. Packing means concentrating as many voters from the opposing party into as few districts as possible, so they win those districts by overwhelming margins, but lose influence elsewhere. Cracking means splitting those same voters across multiple districts, so they never form a majority, effectively diluting their voting power. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, these tactics can significantly distort election outcomes, allowing one party to win far more seats than their share of the statewide vote would suggest. Over the years, this has led to districts with shapes so bizarre they have been compared to ink blots, snakes, and even pieces of spaghetti. The stakes are high because once these lines are drawn, they often remain in place for a decade, influencing every congressional race in that state. This is where Texas and California come in. Texas, controlled by Republicans, has experienced one of the fastest population booms in the country, gaining 2 new seats in Congress after the 2020 census. California, largely run by Democrats, is facing the opposite situation. For the first time in its history, it has lost a seat due to slower growth and migration to other states. Each state is now using its map drawing process, whether through direct legislative control in Texas or an independent commission in California, to secure the most favorable outcome possible. What happens in these 2 states will not just determine local representation. It could reshape the balance of power in Washington for years to come. In Texas, the political battlefield starts with a single number from the 2020 census: 2. That is how many new congressional seats the state gained thanks to one of the fastest population growth rates in the country. Over the past decade, Texas has added nearly 4 million people, driven by booming job markets in cities like Austin, Dallas, and Houston, as well as suburban expansion and an influx of residents from other states. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, much of this growth has come from Hispanic, Black, and Asian communities, groups that have historically leaned Democratic in statewide elections. But here is where the strategy comes in. Republican lawmakers, who control both the state legislature and the governor's office, have proposed maps that cluster many of these Democratic-leaning voters into a smaller number of districts, while spreading Republican-leaning voters across more districts. Analysts from the Texas Tribune estimate that the GOP could secure as many as 5 additional seats in the U.S. House under this plan, far beyond what simple population changes would suggest. One striking example is the redesign of the 7th congressional district in the Houston area. Once a competitive swing district, the new map pulls in heavily Republican suburban areas while pushing many Democratic voters into neighboring districts. Another example is in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, where minority-heavy urban neighborhoods are being packed together, reducing their influence in surrounding suburban districts. Critics, including the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, argue that these maps dilute the voting power of minority communities in violation of the Voting Rights Act. Lawsuits have already been filed, claiming the proposed lines intentionally weaken the political influence of groups that accounted for 95% of Texas's recent population growth. Republican leaders counter that their maps comply with all legal requirements and simply reflect the geographic distribution of voters. But make no mistake, this is not just about local representation. Every seat gained here could help tip the balance of power in Congress. And while Texas plays offense, California is preparing a countermove that could blunt those gains or even reverse them entirely. California's situation is almost the mirror image of Texas. For the first time in its history, the Golden State lost a congressional seat after the 2020 census, a reflection of slower population growth and net migration to other states like Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. The loss means that instead of 53 seats in the U.S. House, California will now have 52. On paper, that might seem like a small change, but in a House where every seat counts, even one less district can shift the balance of power. Unlike Texas, California does not let its state legislature directly draw the new maps. Instead, it relies on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, a 14-member independent body made up of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 members with no party preference. The Commission's mandate, established by voter-approved propositions, is to create maps that are fair, respect community boundaries, and avoid favoring or discriminating against any political party. In theory, this should prevent extreme gerrymandering. In practice, the process is still political. Interest groups, community organizations, and even political consultants can submit map proposals and lobby for specific changes. According to the Los Angeles Times, several Democratic-aligned groups have been active in pushing for district boundaries that safeguard vulnerable incumbents, particularly in regions like the Central Valley and parts of Southern California. One example is the 21st Congressional District, a swing seat in the Central Valley currently held by Democrat Jim Costa. The proposed adjustments could consolidate more Democratic-leaning areas into his district, making it harder for Republicans to flip the seat. Another is the 25th District in northern Los Angeles County, where shifting boundaries could reduce the number of Republican-leaning precincts. Governor Gavin Newsom has not directly intervened in the commission's work, but his administration has signaled support for approaches that maintain California's strong Democratic delegation. The state's defensive strategy is clear. Hold on to as many seats as possible so that any Republican gains in Texas are neutralized on the national scoreboard. But these two state battles are not isolated skirmishes. They are part of a much bigger fight that spans the entire country. The redistricting war in Texas and California matters far beyond their borders. In the current Congress, the majority margin in the House is razor thin. Just a handful of seats separate the two major parties. That means even small changes in district boundaries can tip the balance of power. If Texas adds several Republican-leaning districts and California prevents Republican gains or loses fewer seats than expected, the national outcome could swing dramatically. This is why national party organizations are pouring resources into these fights. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee are both funding legal challenges, organizing grassroots campaigns, and crafting media narratives aimed at influencing public opinion. These efforts matter because redistricting outcomes often last for a decade, shaping not just one election, but multiple cycles. And if you think this is just about party politics, wait until you see how it could change the way your own vote counts, even if you live thousands of miles away. To really understand why these fights in Texas and California are so consequential, we have to look at the mechanics of how map wars are actually fought. Gerrymandering may sound like an obscure political term, but in practice, it is one of the sharpest weapons in the political arsenal. Imagine a state with 10 districts and voters split evenly between two parties. 5 districts would naturally lean one way, 5 the other. But if one party controls the map-making process, they can redraw the lines to guarantee a far greater share of seats than their actual support in the population. They do this using 2 main techniques. The first is called packing. This is where you take as many voters from the opposing party as possible and cram them into just a handful of districts. Those districts become landslide wins for that party, but their influence in the rest of the state is erased. The second technique is cracking. Here, you split clusters of opposing voters into multiple districts, pairing them with enough of your own supporters to make sure they can never form a majority. The result is a map that looks fair on paper, but is heavily tilted in practice. According to the nonpartisan Princeton Gerrymandering Project, these tactics have been used in states like North Carolina and Maryland to create some of the least competitive districts in the nation, where incumbents win by margins so large that challengers barely bother to run. The shapes of these districts can be so distorted they have become infamous in political lore. One North Carolina district drawn in 2016 was described as a snake slithering across the state, because it stretched over 160 miles while remaining only a few miles wide in most places. In Pennsylvania, a district struck down by the state's Supreme Court in 2018 was so irregular that one political scientist joked it could only be drawn by a drunken cartographer. These extreme shapes are not accidents. They are deliberate designs to create a predictable outcome for years to come. What makes the current map war unique is the scale and timing. Both Texas and California are redrawing lines in a Congress where the majority margin is razor thin, meaning just a few seats could flip control. And there is an added twist. The courts have become a battlefield too. The Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that federal courts cannot judge partisan gerrymandering claims, leaving most of the fights to state courts. That means the outcome often depends on the political leanings of local judges, adding yet another strategic layer to the game. When you combine the map manipulation itself with legal battles and high-stakes national politics, you get a war where the front lines run not through streets or neighborhoods, but through the invisible boundaries on a map. Boundaries that will quietly shape power in Washington for the next decade. Multiple lawsuits are already underway, challenging the legality of Texas's proposed maps. Federal courts will have to decide whether they violate the Voting Rights Act or constitutional protections against racial discrimination. California's commission-drawn maps could also face challenges, though they are less vulnerable because of the independent process. The Supreme Court has historically been reluctant to strike down maps on purely partisan grounds, but it has acted in cases involving racial discrimination. According to NPR, some legal experts believe that if the court takes up either case, it could set new precedents for how far states can go in drawing partisan lines. There is also the possibility that delays from litigation could force states to use temporary maps for upcoming elections, creating confusion for candidates and voters. So what happens if the courts throw out both sets of maps? That is when things get messy and unpredictable. Special elections, redrawn boundaries mid-decade, and a fresh wave of political maneuvering could follow. Texas is playing offense, adding new districts to lock in Republican gains. California is playing defense, trying to protect Democratic strongholds. Together, these strategies could shift the balance of power in the House of Representatives for years to come. Redistricting might seem like an abstract process happening far from everyday life, but it directly affects which issues get attention in Washington and which communities have a voice. The map is one of the most potent weapons in politics yet. Most voters do not realize its impact until the results are already set. If you care about how your vote counts, understanding and following these battles is essential. Do you think it is fair for politicians to draw their own maps, or should independent commissions take over? That question will define not just this fight between Texas and California, but the future of American democracy itself. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe so you can follow every twist in this map war, because the next move could decide who runs Washington.